Chères étudiantes, chers étudiants, distingués invités, bienvenue à notre campus et surtout à la Faculté de sciences sociales. Ce bâtiment est notre laboratoire de recherche. Et c'est ici, dans la Faculté de sciences sociales, qu'on développe les idées, qu'on critique les idées et qu'on partage les idées. Et sans doute, on va faire toutes ces trois choses ce soir. Mon nom est Roseanne Devlin. Je suis la vice-doyenne à la recherche pour la Faculté des sciences sociales et je suis aussi une économiste. J'aimerais d'abord vous remercier de votre présence. It is truly a pleasure to see you here in such great numbers. Un grand merci aussi à la chaire de recherche Jean-Luc Pepin et son titulaire Kevin Page pour l'organisation de cet événement. In fact, in addition to his long service in several cabinet posts under Prime Ministers Pearson and Trudeau, the late Honorable Jean-Luc Pepin was a professor of political science here at the University of Ottawa. And given his reputation for tackling difficult issues, I'm sure that he would be delighted to have his name associated with the topic of this evening's panel discussion, the state of the Canadian economy. I'm very pleased to welcome you here this evening for an event designed to tackle an issue that affects us all. It is clear from following the political campaigns and watching the debates that the state of the economy is a dominant feature in this election. Pour en prendre plus sur ce sujet et vous aider à faire un choix informé lors du vote du 19 octobre, j'ai le plaisir d'inviter Guillaume Nolin de l'Association des économistes québécois sur scène pour présenter les panélistes de ce soir. Merci.
Alors, bonsoir. Good evening. L'Association des économistes québécois est heureuse de s'associer à la chaire de recherche Jean-Luc Pepin pour présenter un panel d'experts qui discuteront des grands enjeux auxquels le Canada fait face. Je tiens à souligner que l'association est une organisation non partisane, mais qui est heureuse d'offrir un forum reflétant une variété d'opinions sur les questions économiques. Tout au long de l'année, dans la région, l'association présente des conférences ouvertes à tous sur des sujets économiques d'actualité et nous invitons tous ceux qui sont invités ce soir à venir à ces événements ouverts à tous. Parmi les activités, vous avez des conférences, des portes ouvertes, etc. Donc, c'est intéressant et pour les professionnels et pour les étudiants de l'Université d'Ottawa. Vous pouvez aller consulter notre programmation au www.économistes.québécois.com ou nous suivre sur Facebook. The Association of Quebec Economists is proud to co-present this panel of experts on the state of the Canadian economy. The association regularly hosts a variety of conferences on economic matters in the Ottawa-Gatineau region, to which you are all welcome to attend. Among our upcoming activities, we have a series of conferences, open houses, and panels on economic matters. You can visit our website at www.économistesquébécois.com or follow us on Facebook. Our panel tonight, notre panel ce soir est composé de 5 économistes chevronnés. Tout d'abord, nous avons M. Pedro Antunes, qui est économiste en chef adjoint et directeur général prévision et analyse pour le Conference Board du Canada, où il travaille depuis 1991. Auparavant, il a travaillé au sein du groupe des prévisions canadiennes à la Banque du Canada. Pedro Antunes is Executive Director and Deputy Chief Economist, Forecasting and Analysis where he at the Conference Board of Canada, where he has worked since 1991. Prior to that, he worked for the Canadian Forecasting Group at the Bank of Canada. Our second panelist, notre deuxième panéliste, est Andrew Sharp. Andrew Sharp est directeur exécutif et fondateur du Centre d'études des niveaux de vie. Il est l'auteur de nombreux travaux sur le marché du travail, la productivité et le niveau de vie. Andrew Sharp is Executive Director and founder of the Center for the Study of Living Standards. He has written extensively on labor market productivity and living standard issues. Our third panelist, notre troisième panéliste, est Scott Clark, qui est un ancien sous-ministre au ministère des Finances, conseiller senior du premier ministre et représentant du Canada au FMI, au G7 et à la Banque pour la reconstruction et le redéveloppement européen. Il est présentement président de C.S. Clarke Consulting. Scott Clark is a former Deputy Minister of Finance, Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister, and Canadian representative to the IMF, G7, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He is currently President of C.S. Clarke Consulting. Our fourth panelist, notre quatrième panéliste, est David McDonald. Il est économiste pour le Centre canadien des politiques alternatives. Il coordonne depuis 2008 le budget fédéral alternatif qui présente une perspective progressiste sur la politique fiscale canadienne. C'est un commentateur régulier sur les enjeux politiques nationaux. David McDonald is an economist for the Center for Policy Alternatives. Since 2008, he has coordinated the alternative federal budget, which takes a fresh look at the federal budget from a progressive perspective. He is a regular media commentator on national policy issues. Notre cinquième panéliste et notre dernier panéliste, our fifth and last panelist, is Jim Stanford, who is an economist for the Unifor Union. He is the author of Economics for Everyone, which has been translated in 6 languages. He writes an economics column for the Globe and Mail and is a regular commentator at the CBC. Jim Stanford est un économiste pour le syndicat Unifor. Il est l'auteur du livre Petit cours d'autodéfense en économie qui a été traduit en 6 langues. Il écrit régulièrement pour le Globe and Mail et est un commentateur régulier à la CBC. Finalement, comme modérateur ce soir, ce sera M. Don Newman qui se passe d'introduction. Cet ancien chef d'antenne de la CBC a couvert la politique canadienne depuis 40 ans et nous sommes honorés de l'avoir ce soir. Mr. Don Newman will be the moderator tonight. He needs no introduction. This former CBC parliamentary editor and anchor has covered Canadian politics for the past 4 decades, and it's an honor to have him with us tonight. Passe une belle soirée. Have a good evening.
Merci et bonsoir tout le monde. Bienvenue. It's a great pleasure for all of us to be here this evening, and it's wonderful, as was said a moment ago, to see so many people hanging from the chandeliers and the lights and everywhere else. It's really quite amazing. And the fact that Tom Mulcair will be here later, I'm sure, has absolutely nothing to do with this magnificent turnout. As you know, we have, and as you've heard, we've had introduced to us a very distinguished panel, and we're going to hear from all of them. The rules are this. We're going to hear for 7 minutes from each of the panelists, and then we are going to, as your professors say when they're not prepared to give you a lecture, talk amongst ourselves. And then beyond that, we will open the floor up, and we will have questions from people. I'm not sure, you may have to shout if you're up there, but anyway, if you're closer here, we can ask questions to everybody. So let's begin. 7 minutes, opening statements, and let's start with Pedro Antunes.
Thank you. Thank you, Don. Je pense que je vais commencer avec un petit commentaire ou un petit point qui serait peut-être controversé, un petit peu controversé. C'est que je pense que le problème de l'économie canadienne présentement, c'est pas un problème de création d'emplois, mais plutôt un problème d'offre d'emploi. On a une économie, c'est vrai qu'il y a, on entend toujours parler dans les médias à chaque jour. Moi, je lis les journaux et j'ai l'impression que ça va très mal, qu'une croissance à l'entour des 2 %, c'est ce qu'on a vécu, disons, au fil des 4-5 dernières années. On est très déçus par ce genre de performance. On est aussi très déçus par la performance de la croissance de l'emploi. Ça veut dire, l'année passée, on a en fait une performance très faible, une croissance de l'emploi qui a à peine atteint le 100 000 personnes, donc une croissance d'à peu près 0,6 %. Et moi, ce qui m'intéresse là-dedans, c'est qu'il y a 2 sources qui contribuent à cette faiblesse. Une, bien sûr, c'est la faiblesse de l'économie, de la demande. On regarde ce qui se passe aux États-Unis, on regarde ce qui se passe au niveau de l'économie domestique, et c'est vrai que l'aspect demande est faible. Mais si on regarde la croissance à plus long terme, si on s'intéresse à qu'est-ce qui est le driver, qu'est-ce qui va nous fournir une croissance à plus long terme, on peut penser à l'économie comme étant comme une entreprise. Et donc, la production se fait avec le capital, avec l'emploi et avec la productivité. Je pense qu'on va parler de plusieurs de ces thèmes ce soir. Moi, je vais en rester rapidement à l'emploi. Ce qu'on voit présentement dans la création d'emplois, c'est vrai que l'économie est faible. C'est vrai qu'en 2014, la plupart des gains d'emploi, et même en 2013, ont été créés par une province, en Alberta, qui était vraiment faramineuse. Au reste du Canada, ça a été quand même assez faible. Mais derrière cette création d'emplois faible, il y a aussi un exodus du marché du travail qui est la cohorte du baby boom. So the baby boom cohort is leaving the workforce in droves, and we've seen the retirement rate really rise from about 0.8% of the labor force in just a few years ago. In the last 3 or 4 years, that retirement rate has gone to 1.2%. So when we look at employment today, for every one person that comes onto the labor force in terms of net addition, there are 1.2 or more people that we have to replace in the labor force. This is a very fundamental piece of the labor force. And I don't think that going forward, we're going to be able to see an economy that generates very strong employment growth because we just don't have the offering. We have so many people leaving the workforce. I think this provides a lot of opportunity. We have seen real wages climb over the past decade in Canada. Real wages have been a good wedge, about 1% above inflation. Going forward, of course, there's some weakness right now in the economy that might be reflected. And certainly when we look at the regions across Canada, as I mentioned earlier, very different performance across the regions. There are weaknesses in certain segments of the labor market. I think the big problem for Canada is that we've not aligned our workforce, our new entrants into the workforce, whether they be immigrants, whether they be students coming onto the workforce, we've not really aligned them very well with the needs of the workforce. We have a situation where some organizations are desperate for skill and talent, and yet we see a fairly high unemployment rate among youths and among some segments of the labor market. So I think that's one of the big concerns, and better alignment and better education of our workforce is primordial. When I go back to that production function, si on revient à la fonction de production, hein, on pense à une industrie, on pense au capital, la main-d'œuvre, la productivité. Le deuxième point que j'aimerais amener, c'est au niveau du capital. Si on regarde l'économie canadienne présentement, il y a eu très, très peu d'investissements privés pour la formation de capital. C'est l'investissement d'aujourd'hui qui va générer la production de demain et même la productivité et la création d'emplois de demain. Et on n'est pas gagnant depuis maintenant quelques années. C'est vrai qu'au niveau du secteur énergétique, ça plonge, l'investissement plonge dans ce segment-là. Mais même quand on regarde dans le secteur manufacturier, quand on regarde l'investissement en machinerie et outillage, qui est très important pour la productivité, c'est très, très faible depuis quelques années. Et c'est faible parce qu'on n'est pas compétitif. Ça veut dire le dernier dollar d'investissement, pendant bien des années, a choisi la Chine, a choisi l'Asie. Maintenant, on voit beaucoup de cet investissement revenir aux États-Unis, peut-être au sud des États-Unis, au Mexique, mais on n'a pas encore fait les gains ici, malgré le fait que le dollar a déprécié beaucoup récemment. Donc, on ne l'a pas vu encore. On a toujours espoir que ça arrive, mais la compétitivité est très importante au niveau du marché du travail. Et le point là-dessus, je pense, c'est qu'on parle souvent we talk a lot about a resurgence in manufacturing, and perhaps with that, we think about a resurgence in manufacturing employment. I don't think we're competitive in labor-intensive manufacturing, and I think we ought to be aware that where we can be competitive is outside of these traditional sectors. Where we've been successful for the last 10 years has been on the services side of the economy, in engineering, in finance, insurance, these types of sectors where we actually have been able to do very well in terms of exports. So I think that's going to bring me to one little last point, if I might. It comes back down to the situation where we have a domestic economy. Notre économie domestique est faible. Si on veut avoir une croissance, une opportunité de croissance, il faut regarder à l'extérieur du Canada. Et le Conference Board, mon organisation, fait beaucoup de travail, beaucoup de recherche sur les marchés mondiaux, sur où est-ce qu'on peut compétitionner dans ces marchés. Il faut regarder à l'extérieur du Canada pour pouvoir compétitionner. Et moi, je dirais que on a même des problèmes à ouvrir les marchés, même à l'interne de notre pays. Donc, il faudrait qu'on regarde premier au niveau des provinces. Les barrières interprovinciales, the interprovincial trade barriers are very significant in this country. When we talk to people that are coming to Canada for the first time, they're amazed that we have free trade agreements between provinces. We need to open up the competition so that we can get more productive and more competitive. And I think we should start right here at home. So thank you.
Merci, Pedro. Maintenant, the next speaker, Andrew Sharp from the Center for the Study of Living Standards. Andrew.
Don, thank you very much. I have a PowerPoint presentation, but I don't think it's going to work in this environment. So I still will use it because I think some of you will be able to see it, but I think I'll largely talk, just make the points in without reference to the PowerPoint. I'm going to talk about policies to foster productivity and innovation in Canada, and I'll also make a couple comments about the macroeconomic environment. In terms of my presentation, when we think about productivity, and that's really the key for our living standards in the future, we think, well, what are the drivers of productivity? And the framework I use is that of the economists. We look at, for example, investment. That's extremely important to integrate new machinery into the equipment. Then we look at innovation. Then we look at human capital, and then we look at the overall microeconomic and macroeconomic environment. So I'll be talking briefly about all those aspects of policies to improve productivity. First, I just want to mention a couple points about macroeconomic stability. There's been a lot of debate in this election about not burdening future generations with excessive debt and the importance of a balanced budget. And I just want to make the point that what really matters for our future generations is the burden of the debt, defined as the debt over GDP, the debt to GDP ratio. We want to keep that stable to not burden future generations. We don't have to have a balanced budget to do that, because you have a debt as basically debt is the numerator, GDP, the denominator, and if they both grow by a certain percentage, that ratio will be the same. So I have a chart that shows that we could actually have a deficit of over $25 billion and still have a stable debt to GDP ratio, which is approximately 31% of GDP. So in other words, we don't need balanced budgets to basically not increase the burden on the future generations. At the same time, basically, if we do have a balanced budget in going forward, we're actually going to see a major decline in the debt to GDP ratio. By 2035, with a balanced budget, it would go down to around 14% from the current 32%. I'm not sure that's optimal, because there's no necessary reason. We already have one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the OECD at this stage, the lowest in the G7. So my point is, I think there's too much discussion about the overall need for a balanced budget. What we need is to have a stable debt to GDP ratio. That really is the key point. Now, turning to my key messages on productivity, it's well known that Canada has a productivity problem, and my chart shows that. We used to be around 95% of the United States in terms of business sector output per hour back in the 80s, and then we declined all the way to 70% in the late 2000s. 95 down to 70%. Why? Because we had much slower growth in output per hour. Fortunately, the last couple of years, there's been a little bit of an uptick, and you'll see that we're already now around 75%. But there's really no reason why we can't get back to what we were before, which is around 95% of the American level of output per hour. So the real goal is to basically increase our relative productivity level relative to the United States. Now, ways to do that, well, I've already mentioned my framework, investment. Well, where are we weak? We've got to identify where we're doing poorly. And one area where we're doing poorly is in investment and communication technologies. The Canadian firms spend on average around 50% as much per worker on ICT as their American counterparts. And you'll see that in the chart, and it's even less in software, which is becoming increasingly important. And we haven't been, it's actually been declining in recent years. So we have a real problem with our ICT investment. We need policies to improve ICT investment. Another area is public investment. Now, we had a boom in public investment during the Great Recession. Now we've come down. We're still not quite as bad as we were in the late 1990s, but there's many good public infrastructure investments that would have long-term gains for Canadians in many areas. They all, of course, have to have good cost-benefit analysis done of them, but there is a need for infrastructure in many areas. That would help our overall productivity growth. Okay. Turning now to the next one, R&D. Innovation is crucial for productivity growth, and R&D is a key part there. And there's different, R&D is performed by businesses, by government, and by universities. But there's a stronger link between business R&D and productivity than between the other performers. Now, our performance on R&D as a share of GDP has not been good, as you see in the chart. We basically, we basically have fallen from around 1.2 percentage points to around 0.8 percentage points. A very large decline. And it's very interesting to look at a country that's very similar to Canada. In many ways, it's our twin, Australia. The same history in terms of same resource-intense economy, same language, and it's very similar to Canada. Yet they've done the complete opposite. As the chart shows, they've increased from 0.2% all the way up to around 1.2%. They've had a massive increase in their ratio of business sector R&D to GDP, unlike Canada. In fact, Australia used to have, we used to be 2.5 times as much R&D per, as a share of GDP. Now, Canada is around 60% of the Australians. So if Australia can have such a strong performance in business sector R&D, there's really no reason why Canada can't do that. I see I'm getting out of time here, so I better go quickly. We have I want to talk about policies for R&D. Just last week, the Center for the Study of Living Standards released a very comprehensive document entitled Key Challenges for Canadian Public Policy, Generate Inclusive and Sustainable Economic Growth. And in that paper, which is a report, really about 300 pages, we outlined more than 100 recommendations for increasing both productivity and increasing labor supply. And I won't obviously have time to go through them. I think I have a minute left. So I'm just going to go some general principles, what we should do. Basically, in terms of we want to improve productivity in this country, we have to make sure we're using best practice techniques. That's really essential. We also have to reallocate resources from low productivity uses to high productivity uses. We also have to make sure that any dead weight loss in the economy, resources that are not being used, are fully utilized. And we also have to realize that there's no necessary trade-off between equity and growth. In fact, there's many equity-enhancing initiatives we can that will have an effect on productivity. Also, in terms of our tax system, it's a more neutral tax system with broad-based, low rates appears to be more effective in improving productivity than other types of tax system. So again, I'll stop there. I think I'm out of time, and I'll turn it over back to our moderator.
Thank you, Andrew. And we will come back to all of these topics when we're in the question and answer session. But let's hear next from Scott Clark. Scott?
Well, it's nice to be here. And I think the topic this afternoon is the state of the Canadian economy. And I can't even keep track of the number of panels I've sat on concerning the state of fill-in-the-blank economy. So this is another one of those. And it reminds me of an event that actually happened when I was in Moscow once discussing the state of the Russian economy with a number of senior Russian officials. And we had a nice dinner, and we were well into the vodka, which is typical of a good discussion when you have Russians. And he was going on, and finally one of my colleagues said, in one word, describe the state of the Russian economy. And he looked up and he said, good. And we all looked at him quite puzzled because all our briefings had said, no, that can't be right. So my colleague said, well, in 2 words, describe the state of the Russian economy. And he said, not good. And that's pretty well my view of the state of the Canadian economy. So am I going to use my 7 minutes to describe the kind of situation that will happen a couple of days after the election, when whoever is elected prime minister will name his cabinet, and he will name, or she will name, or he will name in this case, a new minister of finance. And I've worked for every minister of finance since 1978, which goes to show you that well, up until 2001, that I do qualify. Can you hear me? That I do qualify for the seniors' benefits, right? Usually, when a new minister comes in, you meet the night before or afterwards over dinner. It's very quiet. You meet with the minister, chief of staff, and you get to know the person. And you have this dinner, and you order a drink, and the minister will say, I didn't ask for this job. I really didn't want this job. I wanted foreign affairs. And so you have this discussion, well, but this is really the one you really do want. It's the one with power. He says, okay. And then he says, well, let's talk about the state of the economy. And then I said, well, do you really want to know that? He said, yeah, I want to know, you're the deputy of finance, what is the state of the economy? And I would have to say, well, it isn't very good. 2015, we've been contracting in terms of growth. We've been underperforming for 5 years, and it's all likelihood we're going to underperform for the next 5 years. The global economy is not doing very well. At that point, he will then order another drink and say, why don't we talk about the budget balance? Because that was a big item of discussion during the election. Now, here it depends on who gets elected. If it's an NDP minister of finance, you're going to have to say, well, guess what? You got deficits as the eye can see. Deficits in 2015, 16, and every year thereafter. So too bad, so sad for balanced budget legislation, right? You've got a problem. If you're a Liberal minister of finance, that minister will say, I told you so, we can run deficits. And if you're a Conservative minister of finance, you don't even tell them anything, right? So, they're kind of upset that the Department of Finance will produce a whole set of numbers. They'll go through the books, and they're going to make it look like it's a lot worse than anyone ever told you. Every budget, every time a government changes, federal, provincial, it's always worse than you thought, okay? So finally, when you get around to the main course, he may say to you, look, this is not very good, but do you have something you could give me for a new growth strategy? Because we really didn't discuss growth during the election. Right? We discussed a lot of other things, but we never discussed how we would get the economy growing. So I want to end seriously with 4 points that if I were Deputy Minister of Finance, I would say would be absolutely critical, no matter who gets elected, to putting together a credible growth strategy for this country. First would be a renewed federal-provincial relationship, one built on trust and cooperation, a new decision-making relationship, because you cannot make good policy in this country at the federal level alone or at the provincial level. You need trust and cooperation. Second, you need to create a real economic union. We do not have an economic union in Canada. It's a joke. A company should not have to go to Germany to export back into Canada so it can sell its product in every province. We do not have mobility of capital, labor, or goods in this country. If you had a true economic union in Canada, the impact on income and GDP would exceed the total impact of all free trade agreements. So if you can negotiate a TPP or a NAFTA, why can't we not get the provinces together to actually have a real economic union? Third, we need a national infrastructure investment strategy. There's no doubt about it. Our infrastructure, whether it's transit or highways, education, social infrastructure, it needs massive new investments. Fourthly, we need to modernize our income tax system. It's out of date. When the income tax system was created, it had 11 pages. It's now over 4,000 pages. It's completely incomprehensible, contradictory, and it is a major drag on productivity, efficiency, and economic growth. We need to bring it into the 21st century. It needs to be simplified. And we need to make it more growth-oriented, less on income taxes, and more on consumption taxes. Those 4 principles, no matter who is elected, if they're not part of a growth strategy for the next 4 years, then we will have a continuation of a serious productivity problem. How did I do? Good.
You did very well on the time, Scott. Very well indeed. Congratulations. David, you're next.
So I also have a PowerPoint. We'll see whether this is a good idea or not. I've got some animated slides. Hopefully that'll be more exciting. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here from the University of Ottawa tonight. One of the big discussions around this federal election has been the deficit and debt. It's been a discussion around the federal debt in particular. And if we are concerned about debt, I actually think that there's a much more important debt outside of federal and provincial debt. It's household debt or private debt. And I think that is where one of our biggest long-term problems will come. The first thing that we need to understand about private debt is we think of private debt as credit card debt. We think, oh, you know, the private debt's gone up because people are buying big screen TVs, you know, they're buying an extra PlayStation. The fact is that most private debt is totally unrelated to that credit, credit card debt, and is primarily related to mortgage debt or housing debt. Now, it means just buying a home. It's a very straightforward transaction, and a very expensive home in most of Canada's major markets. So when we talk about debt, what does the debt picture look like in Canada, and what has it looked like historically? So the first line here is the red line. This is the federal debt as a share of GDP. Now, Andrew talked a little bit about GDP, which was great because he presaged this message here. This is a percentage of GDP, and you can see that federal debt is actually down substantially since the highs that we saw in the 1990, after the cuts in particular, the Martin cuts in the 1990s. And it's down to lows that we really haven't seen since the late 1970s. And just to give you some idea of scale, this is percentage of GDP, but in terms of dollars, the largest deficit that is even under consideration in this campaign is $10 billion, which would be worth about half a percentage point on this graph. So you wouldn't be able to see it in essence. To move this graph up 1% would be worth about $20 billion, a deficit of $20 billion. And we're not even discussing that in this election. Now, the second big area is other government debt, which is primarily provincial. Some of it's municipal, most of it's provincial. But you can see the provincial debt has actually stayed fairly stable. In fact, there's a historic crossing that just happened this year in that provinces now have more debt than the federal government, which is an historic crossing, actually, which shows, I think, that most of the important big spending expansions are happening at the provincial level. These are things like healthcare and childcare, and those expenses are falling primarily on provincial shoulders. But, and here's the final line, this is household debt. And you can see a tremendous difference between the path of household debt and government debt. You can see that federal debt, the red line, and household debt were actually very similar in the 1990s, and they went in completely opposite directions, with household debt now reaching close to 100% of GDP, in contrast to federal debt, which is at about 30%, and so is provincial at about 30% of GDP. Now, why is this a problem? In fact, interest rates are at record lows, which is one of the reasons why households can carry this debt. That is to say, it takes a lot less to service a mortgage at 3% than it did at 9%, which is the kind of mortgage rates that you would have seen in the 1990s, for instance. I think, first of all, it becomes a substantial drag on growth as we go forward. Households are substantially constrained in terms of how much more they can spend driving the economy. We talk about stimulus and how much impact governments have had. In fact, governments that ran essentially a balanced budget last year, the federal government running a slight surplus, it was about a $2 billion surplus. In terms of stimulus, households ran a $78 billion deficit last year. And the year before, they ran a $79 billion deficit. So there are massive deficits being run in the household sector, and what that means is people are taking out mortgages and they're buying houses. And those houses are being built, and it's been a very important means by which we've stimulated the economy is through additional household debt. Now, you might say, well, additional household debt has been offset by increased housing prices. So if you've owned a home through this period, you've been very successful. Your investment strategy, which is to own a home, has seen substantial increases in wealth. But one of the interesting features of wealth is that it's not evenly distributed. The people with the debt are not necessarily the people with the assets. And so one of the things that I looked at is how much net worth, that is to say your assets minus your debt, have changed in different age groups and in different deciles since 1999, which is the start of the increase in housing prices in Canada. So the question is which age groups and which parts of those age groups in terms of wealth deciles have benefited from massive increases in the value of houses, as well as increases in the price of debt. And so you can see that this is the middle decile, the blue. 20-year-olds and 20-year-olds and 40-year-olds have seen some increase in net worth. They've seen about a 30% increase comparing, say, 40-year-olds today versus 40-year-olds in 1999. 30-year-olds have done badly in the middle. Houses are much more expensive, and so they've actually seen a decline in net worth over that period. Now, this is for the middle decile. Now, this is what's going to be fascinating. This is for the wealthiest decile. And you can see that for 20-year-olds and for 40-year-olds, they've seen a doubling in net worth since 1999 compared to their peers a decade earlier. Now, interestingly, 30-year-olds, even if they're in the wealthiest decile, have not done tremendously well. They've certainly done better than the middle, but not done tremendously well, which I think speaks to one of the major purchases that Canadians make, which is a house. They often buy that in their 30s, and the increase in house costs and the debt needed means that there's a substantial impact on net worth. Now, these are just the percentage changes. What you'll find really fascinating is the dollar changes and the dollar values. So this is the exact same graph, but instead of percentages, this is the value or the net worth of middle-class 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and 40-year-olds in 2012. And you can see that these lines barely appear. So the net worth of 20-year-olds in the middles, these are going to be you folks here, is about $8,000. So, you know, you've got some savings, maybe you've got a car, and you've got some student loans. So fair to say it's not a lot of money. In your 30s, your net worth goes up for the folks that are 30 in 2012 to about $60,000. Most of this is the purchase of a large house being offset by a large mortgage. So there's definitely an increase in net worth, but it's relatively small. For people in their 40s, they've started to pay down that mortgage to some degree, and so they see a net worth of about $180,000 in 2012. Now you'll love this. This is the net worth of the top 10%. The top 10% of 20-year-olds are worth $500,000 in their 20s. They are millionaires in their 30s, and they're worth $2.5 million by the time they reach their 40s. And this is, and remember, these have doubled. These values have doubled since 1999 for the top 10%. And this is, I think, the real problem of debt, is that the debt has been created as part of the cycle of higher real estate prices, and the increase in assets, most of this is due to real estate, although some of it's due to small business, has gone disproportionately to the top and wealthiest in each one of these age categories. And so I think one of the big challenges going forward, as I'm running out of time and Don's getting up, is how do we deal with household debt driving down this and driving up incomes to try to offset some of these large debt loads, and how do you overcome a $500,000 head start from folks that are in the top 10% in their 20s? Thanks, I'll wrap it up there.
And Jim Stanford.
Don, this is awesome, isn't it, with the balconies up here? I kind of feel I'm at the Opera House. Yeah. I've always wanted to give a presentation at the Opera House.
I thought you were, for a moment, I thought you were going to say you always wanted to sing. So I'm glad it's only a presentation.
No, Don, you were right.
Please.
It was a recession, even if a technical recession.
Do-wah, do-wah. All right, go ahead.
All righty. Well, spontaneous applause to that one, the first and only operatic economic performance. They never invite economists to the Opera House because we're too boring. All righty. Well, there's my book. There's my Twitter handle, uniforvotes.ca. I'm going to be citing an economic report on the performance of different governments in the post-war era that can be found at uniforvotes.ca. So I think the challenge we face in Canada has been made worse by a kind of complacency. Since we survived the 2008-09 financial crisis relatively better than some other countries, in particular we had no bank failures, many of us have spent the last several years patting ourselves on the back and thinking that Canada is a leader. and somehow exceptional in the world. In fact, one prominent politician's exact words were that our economy was the envy of the entire world. And I'll let you Google which politician it was. The reality, of course, is very, very different. We've had a period of sustained slow growth and underperformance, the worst since the Great Depression. We did slip into recession in the first half of this year, but that, in a way, is beside the point of a longer-run problem of very slow growth, falling backwards in the rankings of other industrialized countries, and relative to other times in our history. So this is a graph that shows real per capita GDP growth in Canada in the different administration periods, and you can see that not just because of the recession this year and not just because of 08-09, Canada's performance over the last decade has been very poor in historic terms. Now, the problem with economic growth is you have to have an engine. It's kind of like a car. And after all, I work for the Auto Workers Union, so I know that technical fact that a car needs an engine in order to go forward. We learned about this, for those of you who are economics students today, in first-year macro. National income is going to be the sum of one of those, of all of those different engines: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. That's not just an accounting identity, it's also a behavioral relationship, because it's going to tell you where growth is coming from. Consumer spending can do a lot to help your overall growth, because it accounts for about half of GDP, but consumer spending can't usually lead the way because consumers have to be getting income from employment generally in order to have money to spend in the first place. And David has shown what happens when spending outruns income and debt starts to rise secularly. So in a market economy, the two most strategic engines are usually business investment on capital spending, which is a sign that they're expanding their output and hiring new workers, or in an open economy setting, what we're able to sell to the rest of the world. And then as a backstop, of course, there's the issue about what is government contributing to the equation in terms of its own spending. So if those are the potential engines of Canada's economic expansion, how are those engines performing? So here are some graphs on the strategic ones, the leading ones, given that consumer spending cannot lead the way unless there's jobs and income being generated in the first place. So this is the growth of real non-residential business fixed capital expenditure in Canada in the post-war era. And again, not just in a short-run sense, but in a longer-run sense, our business investment performance in Canada over the last decade has been abysmal, despite the very expensive tax measures which have been implemented with the goal to expanding business investment. The same is true to an even higher degree of exports. We've had a government that speaks about globalization and the need to sign free trade agreements, but in terms of actually ensuring that we can produce goods and services that are sold in the rest of the world, it's been absolutely a failure. The worst performance of any industrialized country over the last decade, and the worst performance of any government in our post-war history. In terms of the role of government program spending as a potential lever for growth, in the event that private sector growth is not leading the way, the picture is not much better. If we look at the whole period of 2006 through 2014, there has been a small increase in real per capita program spending by the federal government. I do exclude military spending from this, a small increase in that, but if we measure it since 2011, when the majority mandate was attained, it's been a very steep decline at over 2% per year, one of the most painful exercises in government austerity in our post-war history. So without investment leading the way, without exports leading the way, and with government now contributing to the problem instead of offsetting it, that begs the key question. What is the engine of our expansion that we need? The main traditional drivers of growth have been disengaged. Consumer spending can lead the way for a while, so long as consumers are prepared to borrow and spend like drunken sailors, but sooner or later that runs out of steam for obvious reasons. I think the fundamental economic challenge for us in this election and beyond is to think of new ways, new strategies to resuscitate investment, net exports, and government investment in both infrastructure and new public programs. Clearly, in recent years, government austerity at the federal level in particular has contributed to our slowdown, not offsetting it and not ameliorating it. One other accounting identity that I'll put up just again for reference, because if we're going to get more spending in those sectors, whether that's net exports or business investment or government program spending, the question is, how are you going to finance that? And this is another accounting identity from macroeconomics that I don't think federal politicians are quite aware of as well. and that is the sum of deficits, the sum of fiscal deficits measured across the sectors in the economy has to equal zero. This is true by definition. So some sectors can be running a deficit and other sectors are going to be running a surplus. What this means is that the surplus in the deficit in the private sector, in the private corporate sector, that's investment minus savings, plus the deficit on international trade, that's imports minus exports, plus the deficit in the public sector, that's government spending minus tax revenues, one way or another is going to have to sum to zero at the end of the day. You cannot have a situation where all sectors are saving simultaneously. If they try to do that, they will put the economy into recession. And this is where the simple-minded emphasis on government reducing its spending in order to eliminate its deficit is risky, where you have to look at what is the impact of that strategy going to be on the private sector. In order to generate a government surplus, as some of the parties are proposing, you will inevitably create and sustain deficits in the private sector. So this is a chance to get beyond some of the simple-minded rhetoric out there. Canada's overarching challenge is clearly to motivate more growth and more jobs. We need it in order to pay our taxes and support our households. This requires a vision to engage one or more of those engines that we talked about. Investment, both private and public, exports, which have performed terribly despite all the free trade agreements that we've signed, and I suspect the TPP, if the government is successful in rushing to get a deal before October 19th, will be more of the same in terms of free trade agreements that hurt us more than they helped us, and the role of government programs. At any rate, the trickle-down approach to stimulating growth, that is, free business, cut its taxes, and sign free trade agreements that are more about corporate rights in the global economy than they are about actually growing Canada's exports, hasn't worked. And I hope this election is a chance to consider some alternatives to that. And with that, I will close with a short area, Don, a very, very short area. No. There you go.
Short.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Luciano. That was terrific. That was just terrific. Bravo, bravo. It seems to me that it's a bit like the Russian economy. The Canadian economy is a bit like the Russian economy that Scott described. It's good, but then it's not good. So let's talk for a moment. I think increased productivity is the thing to drive increased growth. And increased investment in R&D, but also in a number of other areas that people have mentioned, is the way to hopefully drive up the productivity. But we do have relatively low taxes, and over the past decade or so, starting even before Mr. Harper was Prime Minister, we've had fairly generous tax incentives for research and development, and they haven't really, I would say to you, probably been taken up the way they have. And I'm wondering, Andrew, why don't we start with you? What is it something about Canadians or Canadian businessmen, or I mean, if Australia can do it, why can't we? Or is it because we're so close to the United States, we let them do it and try and import it? Or what's the matter?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't think anyone knows the answer for why our business sector just hasn't gone out and invested in R&D. They certainly have the tax system there in favor of them, and they certainly have the money there. They know that they often have cash balances that are large, so they have the resources to do it. I think there's a lot of factors at play. One is possibly we don't have as competitive economy as we need. If there were more competition in certain areas, that might stimulate more investment in R&D to stay ahead. Also, I think the structure of our support for R&D can be questioned. Most of our support goes towards tax incentives, not direct grants to firms. Almost all of the countries have much more balance in their support for R&D, and we probably should be rebalancing in Canada towards more direct support grants for firms for R&D. But overall, it's the business sector that has to do that R&D, and it's just not doing it. You know, it's not as if government can come in and tell them what to do. They make their own decisions.
So, Scott, I mean, you ran the finance department. Do you think that there should be more direct grants to spark R&D, or do you think that the tax incentives to do it are enough? How do you feel about that?
No, I would not support any kind of direct grants. That's kind of trying to pick winners, and I don't think that's going to work. The tax credits that we had in the past turned out to be very expensive without much of an impact. So I don't think they're doing very much. I'm like my colleague here, is it's always been a mystery to me of what's driving innovation or not driving innovation in Canada. I think one of the issues is patents, that we don't have enough patent protection, right? Because if you go and speak to Jim Basiley from RIM, he will tell you that at his time when he was still running RIM, he spent most of his time and much of his money trying to protect his patents. And so when you have companies doing innovation and research, what will happen is they may get the patent, and then they'll spend all their time fighting with large American companies to protect that patent. The other issue is if you go to Silicon Valley, and I have a very close family member there, they will tell you that what drives innovation there is failure, right? There, you have to fail to succeed. I think there's a sense here, if you fail on an innovation, if you fail, you try and create a company, it fails, so sad, too bad, you've had it. If you try and raise money in the Silicon Valley, you don't get money until you've shown that you've failed, right? It's like getting a line of credit at the bank. You want a line of credit, you've got to be able to borrow the money and pay it back. In the Silicon Valley, they don't look for the government, they look for success, and everyone has to make the greatest effort. If you fail, you get back up and you do it all over again. So I think there's a certain psychology going on in here that we just can't get the small entrepreneurs to undertake that kind of innovation.
Pedro, most of your members aren't that small entrepreneurs, but again, they fit into that category that Andrew was talking about, and Scott confirming that they're not doing enough R&D and they're not doing enough to innovate and be competitive.
Well, it's really a tricky question. I would agree that when we look at those factors that we know drive productivity, I think we're lacking there. We certainly know there's a strong link between infrastructure investment, for example, private investment, and getting more capacity or more production out of the economy. But economists also break it down into this other term, which is that piece of productivity, which is what we call multi-factor productivity, and it's essentially the efficiency at which capital and labor combine to produce output. And that piece is elusive, and it has been performing very badly. I think part of the reason is due to some sectors in the economy, so we need to be specific about what we're looking at. But that elusive piece, I think, is driven by some of the things that have been said here. Competition. I think we need to open up our economy to more competition. Scott, and I think I tried to mention it as well, the issue around opening competition among our provinces first. We don't even have economies of scale in this country, and we have a lot of inefficiencies due to that. And I've always referred to that to productivity as a little bit like evolution. You know, you kind of need a stress to the system before you kind of see it kind of appear. And one of the factors that we often forget about is that within an industry, there are some very productive firms and there are some less productive firms. And if we don't open up the competition where there are failures, we don't see those more productive firms, the ones that know how to that are efficient, we don't see them gain market share and be competitive on a global scale.
Well, let's think then about trade agreements, because trade agreements, while they're meant to open up markets, they also open up competition at home. And David and then Jim, both of your organizations have been leery, I might say, about trade agreements. Would that be fair to say? And I'm wondering if you think that in retrospect, maybe if we'd had more competition, we would be more productive, and we would, in fact, as we became more productive and innovative, we might have actually expanded exports through the trade agreements, while at the same time guaranteeing most of the jobs here in Canada.
I guess one of the big debates around trade agreements is that trade agreements are actually not about trade anymore. They're actually about corporate rights. So the ability for a Canadian company to export to the U.S. in terms of the tariffs that they would pay exporting a widget from here to the U.S. are actually quite low, and that's true not only to the U.S. but most major trading partners. That traditional barrier to trade, that is to say there's some tariff that goes back and forth, have been largely eliminated. And what a lot of major trade agreements now are about are the rights of corporations to sue governments if they don't like the laws that those governments are putting forward. And so a lot of the objections that and Jim can speak to this afterwards, that the CCPA has leveled against these agreements is not so much that we object to trade per se. Canada does a lot of trade, but it's rather that corporations have the ability to overwrite Canadian laws, have the ability to take Canadian governments to court to force them to take out laws that they think are non-competitive, quote unquote, and removes the ability of Canadian citizens to decide for themselves what their health and safety regulations, what their pollution regulations, and so on should be worth. So why don't I turn it over to you, Jim? I know you've done some work on this as well.
Well, I believe completely in trade. Trade is essential to Canada, given the size of our market, especially if we want to participate in any specialized high-value industries, whether that's manufacturing or innovative services or even tourism. Those all depend on trade, and precisely the problem is not that we've had too much trade, it's that we've had too little trade. More specifically, too little demand from the rest of the world for the products that we make in Canada. So our performance, the Bank of Canada data has confirmed this, is the worst of all of the industrialized economies over the last decade in boosting our exports. And it's not just the amount of exports, it's also the quality of our exports has deteriorated because we've become so much more reliant on extraction and export of unprocessed resources, while our value-added manufacturing and services industries have shrunk significantly relative to GDP. So I believe in any trade agreement that stimulates the demand for Canadian high-value products and services to at least the same degree as it's going to stimulate our imports. And a traditional NAFTA cookie-cutter free trade agreement isn't doing that. The latest point in case is the Korea Free Trade Agreement, which came into effect on January 1st of this year. We've got 7 months of data on our free trade agreement with Korea. Now that we have free trade with Korea, our exports to Korea are down 7% year over year. Our imports from Korea are up 8%. And our trade deficit with Korea has grown by about 30% and will be its biggest ever this year. That's because our trade negotiators did not look at what can we actually export to Korea and how can we actually enhance those opportunities. They just assumed free trade always benefits both sides. Let's sign the deal because it makes us look like good economic managers. I'm worried they're going to do the same with the TPP. And here's a sleeper on the TPP. The TPP is not just a new free trade agreement with countries that we don't have free trade with yet, like Japan. It is also the full renegotiation of the NAFTA, because the 3 NAFTA countries will all be within the TPP, so the rules within the TPP will supersede the rules we've had in NAFTA. And we're just now cottoning on to how enormous those changes could be. We've looked at the auto content rules, which would be watered down dramatically under the current TPP proposal, and there's all kinds of other industries where completely replacing NAFTA with this new agreement that most Canadians haven't even heard of would usher in some enormous changes, not necessarily anything like the economic models about competition and efficiency and mutual trade.
Andrew, did you want to jump in on that? Because it seems to me, and not entirely, but one of the bigger exports, certainly to the developing world by Canada, is our manufacturing jobs, and the TPP will tend to maybe accelerate that. But anyway, our manufacturing jobs in Canada are now going offshore.
Oh, that's right.
As they have in a lot of developed countries. But
well, hopefully they're low-end manufacturing jobs, and we can still keep many of the high-paid design and jobs in Canada. But I think it's inevitable. There's been a massive decline in our manufacturing share. About 10% of workers are now in manufacturing, down from around 18%. Now, the reason that's one of the reasons historically why manufacturing share of GDP has fallen is because we've had higher productivity growth in manufacturing than in the non-manufacturing part of the industries. However, the reason why manufacturing has declined since 2000 is because the growth for our manufactured goods has plummeted. And that's linked partly to the overvaluation of the dollar and also linked in part to the weak U.S. economy. And that hopefully that will be turning around in the future with a stronger U.S. economy. But we've really got to get into more of the emerging markets. We have many possible exports, including some type of manufacturing products, also services. We have to be out there and much more diversified in terms of our export pattern for exports.
Scott, were you looking to say something on this too, or no? Well, in terms then of into other markets, particularly developing markets, it seems to me, Pedro, that really, and we're seeing this particularly in China, which is a well-organized country, but they started off with the low-end jobs. Now they're doing the middle-end and higher-end jobs, and pretty soon they're going to be doing all of the jobs in the sense that Andrew's formula works for a little while, but sooner or later they don't want to just put on the screw. They want to design the screwdriver that does it and the car that they're putting it on.
Well, I think what we've lost so far in terms of the restructuring that we've seen in manufacturing has been those low-end jobs. We just cannot compete on a labor-intensive manufacturing process with China. And in fact, the restructuring, it didn't happen, as you mentioned, it happened all over the developed world. It actually happened to Mexico first, because they were the kind of low-end supplier into the North American supply chain, and they got displaced first. It happened second in the U.S., and in fact, manufacturing employment held very well in Canada because of strong productivity gains, and we were holding on because of a weak dollar up until 2004. I think we're in a phase now where we are competing is on the services side of the economy. If you look at Canada's job creation over the past decade or the past 15 years, we've seen a huge restructuring in manufacturing. We've seen 500 or 1,000 or so losses in manufacturing employment, but we've seen a gain of just as many in other professional scientific services. And these are well-paid jobs. These are jobs that are also serving the export market. And I think this is where Canada can compete. We can still compete on the design and high end on the manufacturing, but where we've had success has been in this service sector. And I think going forward, when we look at the free trade agreements, they're not about tariffs anymore. They're about mobility of labor, and they're about our ability to get into those markets with our professional services, with our insurance, with our engineering services, et cetera. I think this is the promise for our economy.
Right?
Is in a context. The global economy, in my view, is in a period of secular decline. And the head of the IMF and other international institutions has been warning us for a number of years now. If you look at China, the prospects for China, Asia, the Euro, EU, they're not good. And I think you cannot develop a growth strategy which relies primarily on a global economy, which could be continuing to decline in terms of its own economic prospects. World trade as a share of global output has been going down for years now. All right? It's not the driving force it used to be. A growth strategy for Canada has to be, in my mind, be inward-looking. We need an actual growth strategy that is made in Canada. We need to strengthen our capacity in Canada to take advantage of whatever trade there might be. And hence, we need a better tax system, we need a better infrastructure system, we need a better our own economic union, because that'll do more for output in Canada than any free trade agreement combined.
Since we're in the middle of an election campaign, let me interject a political note to that, because you have worked on trying to get rid of interprovincial trade barriers. The Conservatives have tried, the Liberals tried, everybody's been trying. As long as I've been around, I think since Confederation, we've been talking about getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers. And one of the real politics is that if you are the mayor of a city, the way you get reelected is running against the provincial government. And if you're a provincial premier, the way you get elected is running against the federal government. And it seems to me that, give me your economic perspective on that, Jim, because that is a real politic question. And the idea of getting rid of all of these different barriers, I'm not sure is ever going to happen.
Well, I don't know if it's politically feasible or not, Don, for the reasons that you mentioned, but I'm also utterly dubious that it would make any measurable difference to our economic performance, to our level of GDP or our rate of GDP growth. The fact that you can't ship beer from one province to another is a lovely windmill to tilt against. But to claim that that is one of our fundamental economic problems is not credible. The fundamental problems we have is in every part of Canada, interprovincial trade or not, we've got resources sitting idly by because there isn't enough money to put them to work. And that should be the focus. There may be things that we can do that make sense on an interprovincial basis, but don't think that it's a panacea any more than international trade is suddenly going to put all those idle resources to work. And that's where I agree completely with what Scott's saying. The focus of our job creation and growth stimulating efforts have to be taking the idle resources we have here and putting them to work.
But you don't think getting, as Scott does, you don't think getting rid of the interprovincial trade barriers is one way to do that?
Well,
Scott, do you want to have a rebuttal?
I know I don't drink beer, but I know you can't buy beer in Ontario from other provinces and so on and so on. That's not the issue. Is I think you need competitiveness, and I think you need mobility of capital and labor, and the ability to contract and not have local laws that keep you out of one province. I think whatever their output effect, it has to be positive. And I can remember when we were doing the NAFTA, and we were building these models, what would be the economic impact on NAFTA? And we were also building, for comparison purposes, what would be the economic impact on Canada if there were mobility of capital and labor. And the results in those days, maybe Jim's got better, newer results, were that if you had an economic union in Canada, that would have a greater effect on output than the NAFTA would.
Now, David, you're talking about household debt. Low interest rates obviously entice people to take on more household debt. And the Bank of Canada earlier this year cut the rate again. And there was even talk that, well, if this recession, which turns out to be a song, but also a technical one, that if it had continued, that maybe the bank might cut it again. I mean, they're already down pretty low. Do you think, though, that if they weren't that low, the economic activity that we have had the last few years would be as high as it was, or would we be in a recession a lot sooner? And is there just a trade-off that I take your point that when rates go up, you know, the rubber hits the road, but without low interest rates, where would we be?
It's a great point, and this is how low can you go is the question for the Bank of Canada, and they're at about how low they can go. They're at what's called the zero lower bound, which is to say they would love to stimulate the economy more. They think growth is weak, but they can't because they can't and are relatively unwilling at this point to create negative interest rates where, you know, the bank pays you back, or you pay the bank rather to keep your money. And so the Bank of Canada has done as much as it can do to stimulate growth. And this is the problem of the zero lower bound. And they've been at that zero lower bound. I mean, this didn't start in January of 2015. They've been at this lower bound for 5 or 6 years now. I mean, since the recession in 2008-9, they've deviated very little from this lower bound. They've had the pedal to the metal in terms of everything they can do to encourage households to take on more debt, drive economic growth, as well as encourage businesses to take on more debt and drive economic growth. Households have taken up the call. They've said, absolutely, central bank, we'd love to take on lots more debt, and hopefully you'll build more houses that we can buy at a higher price. The corporate world is looking great. Their balance sheets look great. You know, one of the other interesting crossings that we saw this year is corporations in Canada now hold more cash than the national debt. So it's a substantial amount of cash sitting on corporate balance sheets that could be spent to stimulate growth. Now, those two sectors, I think the household sector has done more or less as much as it can. The corporate sector at this point is not interested in substantial new investments. And that leaves either imports and exports, which we've been running a deficit in since the Great Recession. So we're importing more than we export, so we're exporting our national wealth. The final group is government. And as we saw on the graph, federal government debt is at one of the lowest points it had been in 30 years. And so if anybody is well placed to spend to drive growth, to do it intelligently, that isn't to say to create a deficit and then burn the money in the ground, but it's to create a deficit for some purpose, which is to say to create economic growth and do it as efficiently as possible. And to do it as efficiently as possible, you want what are called sort of high multiple expenditure areas. Those are areas where you create jobs immediately in Canada. Those are going to be areas like infrastructure spending, but they're also going to be areas where you're expanding social programs and you're hiring people as well to work in the economy, work in Canada, and not export that money immediately. And so I think the point that I'm getting to is that governments are the last stage in terms of stimulating growth. And unfortunately, that's not a discussion we're having. I mean, $10 billion a year is essentially nothing in a $2 trillion economy like Canada's.
No, except that in terms of what happens in the future. I mean, you made the argument, I thought, a fairly compelling one, that people take on debt because interest rates are low, and at some point interest rates go up, and then their debt is too hard for them to carry. But at the same time, and Scott, you would remember back to the 80s when the government was running successive deficits, by about the end of the 80s, the payment on the debt was the biggest spending program in the government. So you can't run a deficit forever, even if it looks like it's easy to do now. At some point, usually the crows come home. You and then Andrew.
We're not even close to the situation in the late 80s. I mean, I agree with what just been said. Monetary policy has exhausted itself. The government of the central bank could simply go on holiday and phone in every couple of months his recommendation that he's not going to raise interest rates. I mean, that's got to be one of the easiest jobs that anyone could possibly have. Now, going forward, if you expect to get out of the situation we're in, we need some economic growth. And we need some demand in the economy. And that's where the government steps in. We have a very low debt ratio. This is not the time, dare I get politic, for balanced budgets. Any commitment to balanced budgets at this time is a terrible policy mistake. We need governments to run some deficits, to create some debt, but not have the debt burden go up. That's quite doable. You can run a deficit of 10, 15, 20, and that debt burden would still fall. Right? We're just caught in the old grape juice that everybody's drank for the last 10 years, that somehow deficits are bad. Not all deficits are bad. Not all debt is bad. It depends on the circumstances. It depends what you're borrowing the money for. Those are the questions you have to ask. We need to borrow money now because we're not doing very well. We're operating substantially below our potential. Our unemployment rate is still 7%. It has been there for an awful long time. We're stuck.
Andrew?
Well, I completely concur with Scott on that. That's great that you have that view. I don't know if that would have been the view 20 years ago, but 20 years ago was different. There we had a situation where the debt to GDP ratio was going up all the time. That's a problem, but now we're on a downward track, so it's a completely different era. At that time, we had real interest rates very high. Now, real interest rates are very, very low. I wanted to comment on the household debt burden. I guess I don't really get too worried about this historic high of household debt, because on the other hand, we also have an historic high of net worth. And basically, interest payments as a share of overall income is falling because of such low interest rates. So I don't really see the crisis. Now, maybe you say all of a sudden interest rates go up, a lot of people are going to be in trouble, but people adjust. They would basically pay off that debt and spend less. And so that I don't see it as a crisis situation right now. I see it more as positive because it is stimulating consumption in the economy.
Well, Pedro, I mean, the real problem is that your net worth, if it's your house and you're living in it, and suddenly either it declines in value or the interest rates go up and you can no longer pay the bank, your net worth changes very quickly. Pedro.
Great. Well, I guess I'd like to comment on this issue, but I'm going to talk about the government debt instead. We talk about the federal government getting to a debt level of 35% of GDP. We say that's not a whole lot, but I think we've forgotten about the situation that the provinces are in. And so if you count the provinces in that number, you're getting to around 70% or over of GDP. Some provinces in worse shape than others. But all provinces, if you look at the aggregate deficit of provinces since the recession, it's hardly improved. We had a $50 billion deficit aggregate for the provinces back in 2009. Now I think we're at somewhere in the range of $40 billion in deficits for the provinces for the aggregate situation. So is that bad or not? The problem is when you look at the provincial situation going forward, they have the two biggest burdens in terms of the long-term outlook, and that is healthcare and education. Healthcare it's really hard to keep healthcare spending at under 5 or 5.5 or 6% in that range, depending on which province you're in. And I think this is going to be the biggest challenge going forward. I don't see the provinces getting out of this situation. I think sooner or later, again, we need that renewed federal-provincial relationships to kind of fix this problem in a way that's both levels of government are involved.
Well, panel, I've kind of lost track of the time here, and you've been so interesting. I've been following you closely. You're not watching the clock. And I'm afraid we have used up our time without going to questions from the audience. So when the panel comes off the stage, if you have any questions specifically for any of the members, buttonhole them, and I know they'd be willing to talk to you. I think, Jim, you have a plane, but the other people are around. Let's give a hand to Jim, David, Scott, Andrew, and Pedro.